This is downtown Los Angeles. There are many things that make this part of LA unique, but there are also features that could easily be mistaken for many downtowns in the US. This phenomenon is happening across the country and is the basis for gentrification, or changing demographics of an area, which causes increased cost of living, prevalence of chain stores, and homogeneity. Notice the coffee shops? Coffee shops have long been associated with gentrification. The idea that once a high-end coffee shop enters a community, it becomes trendy, attracts wealthier residents, and pushes longtime residents out. Is this true, though? Are coffee shops actually causing gentrification in Los Angeles? Let's find out in Coffee and Change: How Gentrification is Shaping Los Angeles. In order to understand what is occurring in the present, it's important to take a step back and look at how coffee has always been a symbol of change in LA. Coffee has long been a staple of life in California, from the gold rush of the mid-19th century to the commercialization of pre-ground and pre-packaged coffee by James A. Folger. The origins of first-wave coffee in Los Angeles began in the 1920s. Its use as an alternative stimulant to alcohol during Prohibition made it popular with those unwilling to smuggle or sneak around the law. Instant coffee also became a favorite of veterans returning home from World Wars I and II, as it was a convenient and often mood-boosting drink for soldiers on the front lines. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, coffee as a staple in American life reached a new level.
Thank you, Patty. Before we get going, I think we ought to start off our afternoon session in a very nice way by having a very tasty cup of Chase and Sanborn instant coffee. Will you join me?
Instant Maxwell House, the amazing coffee discovery.
Now, other leading brands of instant coffees are hollow bubbles, like this. But Borden's flavor crystals are solid, pure coffee through and through.
Richer, stronger Hills Brothers coffee. And new Instant Hills Brothers coffee. The first instant coffee that smells like coffee.
I've got news for you about Borden's instant coffee.
As its popularity grew, the previously common experience of drinking coffee slowly separated into two scenes. The high-class diner experience, where it was often served with meals and blended into the American cuisine, and low-class standalone coffee shops, which were often part of the underground nightclub scene and catered to the brewing counterculture movement. Venice Beach's Gas House opened in 1959, frequented by poets, artists, musicians, stoners, beatniks, and neatniks. It served as an integrated coffee house and nightclub, where people could drink coffee, sleep, and share their work. If the fact that it catered to people generally considered undesirable at the time wasn't enough, it was also located in the heart of a rapidly deteriorating and crime-ridden Venice. This parallels Pandora's Box, a coffee house and nightclub on Sunset Strip that ran throughout the 60s. Well known as a hangout for underage drinking and drug use, it quickly gathered a negative reputation in the area. It was also the site of the 1966 Sunset Strip riots, where protesters resisted against the youth curfew and recent crackdowns on nightclubs. As the reputation of coffee houses plummeted, so too did their profits. This was exacerbated by formerly underground scenes entering the public spotlight and becoming tourist hotspots. Coffee had to adapt quickly, and by the early 70s, nightclubs and coffee houses went their own ways. This began the second wave of coffee. Independent coffee shops started to cater to the general public, and coffee shops as a communal space became relaxing places where one could go to read or get work done. Coffee shops also started experimenting with higher quality beans, which both raised the cost of running a store and the coffee itself. The first Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf opened in Brentwood in 1962, and it took off as a chain in the 1970s. Throughout the decade, it expanded to over 10 stores in the LA metro area and built a roasting and distribution facility in Camarillo. The 1980s and 1990s were a transformative period in the Los Angeles coffee scene.
For the cup of good coffee, I just walk half a block north on 4th Avenue to Starbucks.
In the last year and a half, Starbucks has nearly tripled in size, growing from 9 to 26 stores.
Oh, they've got the usual Starbucks inventory of coffee beans and bulk teas, espresso machines, and all the other coffee paraphernalia. But it's the espresso bar that draws me for a pick-me-up after a couple of sleepy hours in the library.
A single pound of his Colombian coffee, Juan Valdez must pick 2,000 coffee beans. Yet he still picks every one of those 2,000 beans by hand.
All those great caffeine-charged drinks with the Italian names Cafe Latte, Cafe Macchiato, and Mocha. I love it.
Because it's easier for you to buy donuts in the supermarket than to make a special stop at Dunkin' Donuts. So we make it worth the trip.
Another social change was developing at the height of second wave coffee. A cup of coffee was becoming more accessible, yet also more expensive. Coffee was no longer an affordable item available to everyone, but a prime example of the country's growing wealth gap. As a result of a growing population and new political interests, LA saw legislation that made it more difficult to purchase housing, an LAPD crackdown on crime, and a period of relative stability in the country, which caused housing values and rents to increase, crime to decrease, and low-income residents beginning to feel the financial pressure of a growing cost of living. LA's third wave coffee scene originated in 1995, when the Conservatory for Coffee opened its doors in Culver City. Coffee shops in this wave focused less on the experience of coffee, but rather the coffee itself. Its emphasis on specialty coffees and sustainability added a degree of complexity to coffee culture, while raising the average price once again. The third wave especially took off in 2007, when Intelligentsia opened its first shop in Silver Lake. In the 15 years since then, Intelligentsia has expanded to Venice, Hollywood, and Pasadena, and its high favorability among coffee drinkers has led to many third-wave shops across the city, such as Portland's Stumptown Roasters and Oakland's Blue Bottle Coffee. In 2019, Blue Bottle Coffee pledged to stop using disposable cups, and a drink can cost between $1 and $12 US. So, what's the story of these three waves of coffee? It's hard to come up with one definitive answer, but it's no doubt that as coffee has become more mainstream, it has also become more expensive. Furthermore, as it became more popular with the general public, more people were willing to pay those prices. Or the people that could afford it, that is. Coffee shops became associated with thriving and up-and-coming neighborhoods, or gentrifying neighborhoods. So what is gentrification? Dr. Craig Allward, a professor of urban studies at California State University, summarizes it as,
gentrification typically is where an older area that has generally gone through disinvestment will start having people come move in, they start reinvesting into it, and typically during that process then you start seeing a lot of social changes. It's usually middle upper class to upper class that moves in, so there's then displacement issues of where a lot of times those underinvested areas were low income, so then displacement becomes a big issue when you talk about gentrification.
This change is defined by second and third wave shops. In 2000, there were 22 Starbucks stores in LA, mostly concentrated in the West Side, Hollywood, and Central LA. Today, there are over 264 retail locations all across the city, even in the often ignored South Central and Boyle Heights. When comparing the median household income of the census tracts containing Starbucks then and now, there's no second guessing that the neighborhoods with stores early on have seen rapidly increased MHIs and property values. As expected, many of these tracts have also seen racial demographics change from largely Hispanic and African American populations to a predominantly white one. Hollywood's first Starbucks opened in 1999. At that time, the construction of the Hollywood Vine and Hollywood Highland metro stations on the Red Line brought in new development, which helped the area recover from its multi-decade reputation as a seedy neighborhood full of gangs and sex shops. As development and the density of Starbucks increased, the demographics changed and many were priced out of their homes. This phenomenon doesn't solely apply to Starbucks. Tracts with Dunkin' Donuts, Coffee Bean, and Pete's Coffee locations have also seen shifts in demographics, though these chains have significantly fewer stores in LA and tend to only open in wealthier neighborhoods, so their impact on gentrification is not as obvious. In contrast to second-wave chains, third-wave coffee shops rarely expand beyond higher-income neighborhoods, though up-and-coming areas will often see an influx of a few third-wave chains. The Arts District is a neighborhood of formerly abandoned warehouses that have been converted into coffee shops, boutique restaurants, lofts, and art galleries. Just a few decades ago, no one would imagine that a sea of warehouses owned by low-income artists would eventually become one of LA's largest coffee scenes. As expected, the neighborhood has seen an increase in median household income and the percentage of white residents. So, are coffee shops responsible for gentrification in LA? The answer is yes, for the most part, but not entirely. There's definitely a correlation between the density of coffee shops and gentrification, but the process of changing neighborhoods is a complex one, fueled by new infrastructure projects and the lack of affordable housing.
Part of gentrification is good. Part of it, you're reinvesting in neighborhoods. Some of the early parts of LA, they're 100-year-old buildings. So they're needing major renovations, and gentrification brings that about. So it's not that's altogether bad, but the displacement is really the issue. And we haven't found an easy policy to prevent that, unfortunately.
If there's one message to take away, it's that coffee shops are not inherently bad. As much as we like to demonize them and say that they're making the city a worse place to be, it's important to realize that they've always been here. They've always been a symbol of change in Los Angeles. For every Starbucks store, there's a coffee shop being opened by someone who wants to contribute to their neighborhood and add their unique take on coffee to the city. Coffee is changing Los Angeles. We are changing Los Angeles.
Someday, I will drink the less